Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are sinking our teeth into a meal that is, well, absolutely inseparable from the history of its nation. Bigos, Poland's famous hunter's stew.
Yeah. And Bigos is far more than just a recipe. It really holds this unique, almost elevated cultural status.
Right.
Our sources, and they cover everything from its 14th century start right through to the precise chemistry of cooking it, and even its place in national literature, they make a pretty compelling case that this deep, slow-cooked meal is actually a powerful metaphor for Polish resilience, for identity.
Okay, so we're going to unpack how this seemingly simple stew of cabbage and meat became the culinary symbol of a country that had to endure centuries of hardship.
Yeah.
And to show you just how deep those roots go, we're starting way back with the monarchs. Bigos origins apparently date back to the 14th century, specifically associated with royal hunting expeditions under King Władysław Jagiello.
It's kind of remarkable when you think about it. We're talking about 700 years of continuous history just simmering away in that pot.
700 years. Wow. Okay, let's unpack this history then, starting in those medieval forests. Part 1. The historical roots of the hunter's stew.
So the initial purpose was, well, purely pragmatic. During King Jagiello's time, these royal hunts were massive events, multi-day affairs.
Right.
Hunters, their whole entourage, they needed something hearty, easily prepared, and probably most importantly, easily transportable, a meal that could really sustain them out there.
And the ingredients were basically dictated by the environment, right? What was available.
Exactly. They used the game they hunted, deer, wild boar, duck mixed with that original superfood of endurance. Sour cabbage. Fermented cabbage.
Ah, the sauerkraut.
Yeah. And even the name, the linguistic roots, kind of give away its nature as this composite dish.
Oh, how so?
Well, there are two main theories. One connects it to the Latin word bigar, which means to mix.
Okay, makes sense.
And the other links it to the German begossen, meaning to pour over.
Yeah.
Both really describe this rich, savory stew perfectly, something that combines lots of different elements.
What's fascinating, I thought, was how quickly it seemed to move down the social ladder. But in a good way.
Totally. It started as this royal hunting luxury.
Yeah.
But our sources show that by the 18th century, bigos had become really common in Polish home cooking. You'd find it in noble manors, sure, but also in the humblest peasant cottages.
So it became a real equalizer dish then, accessible across society.
Pretty much. Though, obviously, the ingredients would vary quite a bit based on class and what people could get their hands on.
Right.
We know it was well established by the late 17th century because bigos actually shows up in Poland's first known cookbook, Compendium Ferculorum, which was published way back in 1682.
1682, wow.
Yeah, and that confirms that even the early versions, made with whatever meats were around, were already seen as a kind of national staple.
That adaptability you mentioned, being able to swap boar for pork or maybe add different spices, that seems like a key thread here.
It absolutely is.
And it brings us right into part 2, the culinary secrets. Because bigos seems fundamentally like an exercise in patience. If you rush it, you don't get it. You miss the whole point.
That's exactly. The secret of bigos really lies in time. And that starts with picking the right ingredients carefully.
Okay.
So the foundation usually relies on two types of cabbage, fresh white cabbage and sauerkraut, the fermented stuff.
Right.
Then you add the mixed meats. Pork and beef are kind of the modern staples now, but they have to be mixed with kielbasa, that essential Polish smoked sausage.
Can't forget the kielbasa.
Never. And then there's the supporting cast, onions, often a spoonful of tomato paste for depth, and that really aromatic core of spices, bay leaves, black pepper, allspice, and crucially,
Caraway seeds.
Caraway seeds, yep. I noticed the sources also mention some optional things to boost complexity, like maybe a splash of red wine or even dark beer sometimes.
Nah, okay.
But the real strategy, the thing chefs really focus on, is the meat blend. You can't just use one type.
Well,
You need multiple textures and richness levels. Pork brings that fat and richness. Beef gives it textural strength, substance. And the smoked sausage adds that immediate, necessary depth and smokiness. It's a combo.
And before you even think about stewing anything, you've got to brown that meat properly, really intensely.
Oh, absolutely. That Maillard reaction isn't just about adding some nice color.
Oh.
No, it's about building this deep foundational flavor, creating the structural complexity for a dish that's meant to last for days, literally.
Right. Okay, so that foundation's built. Then comes the tricky part, the balancing act.
Exactly. This is where the true test of the cook begins. Because if you just dump in a massive amount of sauerkraut, the whole thing will just be overwhelmingly sour. Way too sharp.
Wait, but didn't you say the rule is like 2 parts sauerkraut to 1 part fresh cabbage? If sauerkraut is the sour part, how do you stop it being too much? Do you just use less?
Well, that's where the technique comes in. You actually have to lightly rinse the sauerkraut before you use it. Yeah, just a quick rinse to wash off some of that excess fermentation liquid, the brine. This helps control that initial sharpness. But rinsing alone isn't enough. It doesn't complete the flavor profile.
No, because then you'd lose some depth, right? And that brings us to what the sources called the secret soul of Bigos.
Exactly. The soul of Bigos is this subtle sweetness that has to counter the tang. That's what creates that really complex, savory, sour, and sweet profile.
And how do you get that sweetness?
Usually through adding dried plums or prunes. Sometimes a spoonful of honey works too.
Yeah.
That's what lifts it from just being, sour cabbage and meat into something truly layered and special.
Okay, so we've got the ingredients, the balance. Now the final, absolutely mandatory ingredient is time.
Time is completely non-negotiable. True Bigos needs slow cooking. Minimum 3 to 4 hours on the lowest possible heat.
Minimum 3 to 4 hours. Wow.
Yeah. You're not trying to boil it hard.
Yeah.
You're trying to coax the flavors out, let them meld. There's a wonderful saying traditional Polish cooks use that captures this perfectly. The dish must whisper, not boil.
Must whisper, not boil. I like that. That's beautiful. And that leads into the final act of patience, doesn't it? The whole aging of Bigos thing.
Yes. You let it cool down completely, stick it in the fridge, and then reheat it the next day. Or even the day after. That's when the real magic happens.
So it actually gets better after a day or two.
Significantly better. Some culinary experts, they really insist it tastes best on the 3rd day, after it's rested and been reheated maybe a couple of times.
So we're basically talking about mandatory leftovers. It sounds like the ultimate power move for a host, telling your guests, you should have been here tomorrow.
Pretty much. It's the ultimate make-ahead meal, but one that demands patience.
Yeah.
And that very necessity for resting, integrating, reheating, that's what makes the link to the national identity so powerful, so fitting.
Okay, this is where we shift into part 3 then. Connecting that multi-day process, that need for patience, directly to Polish identity and endurance. It's kind of astonishing that a recipe dictates not just ingredients, but how long it has to rest. It almost demands reverence.
And that reverence is earned because Bigos is often used to symbolize Polish endurance, but also community, warmth. It's a staple dish served during the most important holidays, Christmas Eve, Easter. It represents continuity.
That metaphor of resilience really becomes clear when you think about Poland's history, especially those periods of partition in the 18th and 19th centuries when the nation literally didn't exist as an independent state on the map.
That's the absolute key context. The dish's regional variations, its inherent adaptability, changing the specific meat or spice blend based on whatever you actually had available. It mirrored the way the Polish people survived those long periods of occupation, famine, political suppression.
It was a cultural constant when everything else was just turbulent.
Exactly. The flavor of continuity, you could say. And the fact that this deep connection is actually codified in the language itself is really telling. There's that famous Polish saying, it's incredibly powerful. Bigos is not made in a day. It matures like Poland itself.
Wow. It matures like Poland itself.
Yeah. That phrase directly links the dish's flavor deepening over time with the Polish national spirit of resilience, surviving through centuries of hardship, foreign occupation. Those multiple days of required simmering and integration become the culinary equivalent of Poland having to wait centuries for its political rebirth.
And the importance of Bigos goes beyond proverbs, right? It actually features prominently in some of the foundational texts of Polish culture.
It does.
I want to highlight the mention in Adam Mickiewicz's epic poem, Pan Pedius, which is the seminal work of Polish Romantic literature written back in 1834.
A cornerstone text. And the description of Bigos cooking at a noble feast in that poem, it links its robust aroma, the whole atmosphere around it, directly with patriotism, with this deep, almost wistful sense of national nostalgia, especially during a period when Poland was partitioned.
It showed that even when the state was gone, the culture that the Bigos remained.
Precisely. The passage itself is so evocative. Mickiewicz's writes, "There was Bigos, the master of Polish dishes. Its fragrance fills the air and warms the heart."
Warms the heart. Yeah, it perfectly captures that deep sense of comfort, of national belonging, especially during times of scarcity or uncertainty.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, Bigos really became this constant tradition, even when resources were incredibly limited. During wars, during the partitions, Poles kept making it. They used whatever ingredients they could scrape together.
So it's a dish of adaptation.
Exactly. It adapts, but it never loses its essential sour, sweet, and smoky core. It became this tangible symbol of a culture that mixes, adapts, and ultimately endures the slow burn of history.
So, okay, wrapping this up, what does this all mean for us? We started with what seemed like just a heavy, hearty stew, and we realized we were actually looking at a culinary symbol of national longevity, resilience, and maybe above all, patience.
I think that's right. We've established Bigos is thick, it's complex. Ideally, you get this deep brown-red color. It has this dense aroma hitting all the notes. Smoky, sour, sweet, spicy.
But the critical takeaway really is that crucial element of time. Patience, care. That's what's required to achieve that final, profound flavor.
Definitely. And traditionally, it's served quite simply, often just with dark rye bread, maybe mashed potatoes, or sometimes boiled buckwheat, served communally, sometimes right out of the big cast iron pot or large wooden bowl, really reinforcing that sense of community.
But let's circle back to that bit of wisdom, that sort of philosophical takeaway from the chef that the sources mention.
Ah, yes. Bigos gets better with time, just like life itself.
That really is a wonderful thought to end on. We've learned that the secret to the best bigos isn't just, the quality of the sausage or the cabbage.
Yeah.
It's the refusal to rush the process. It's letting all those different components truly meld, deepen, integrate over days.
So maybe we can encourage you, the listener, to think about what complex, meaningful elements in your own life. Maybe it's knowledge you're trying to master, or a really long-term project you're working on, or maybe the deep trust in your most cherished relationships. Maybe consider how those things similarly require that investment, that time, that patience, that metaphorical reheating over days, months, or even years.
To truly reach their full, rich flavor.
Exactly. The greatest achievements, like the greatest stews, simply cannot be made in a single rushed day. They need time to mature.